Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Granville, and I'd like to thank you for joining me here for the introductory session of the STIR method. And before we go too far into it, I'd like to go over my care philosophy. At the core of every human being, there is a divine wisdom that knows who you are, what your soul prefers. This deep knowing from the soul speaks through the heart to the gut, brain, and mind body, allowing the ego or social environmental influences to lead you away from this divine wisdom is the root cause of all disease and manifests in the body as symptoms. Healing is the process of remembering who you are and then living true to yourself. And my favorite two-word quote is from Gabor Mate: authenticity heals. So the STIR method, STIR, is an acronym for somatic trauma imprint release. What is a somatic trauma imprint? A somatic trauma imprint is an emotional snapshot taken from the level of consciousness that endured the trauma. Now, that emotional snapshot is carried in the soma. We have myofascial knots in 4 places in our body: right here in our chest on each side, and between our hip bone and our pubic bone down in our pelvic region. So a somatic trauma imprint holds the emotional and physical recipe that it took to endure the trauma. And that trauma imprint is then blocked off from consciousness. It's called body armoring, and we'll get into that a little later. So I got into this because of my son McCoy. He was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 4. And throughout his journey through the Western medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex, he was constantly put in positions of fear. And when you are in stress, when you are in fear, when you're anxious in a traumatic environment, you hold a multitude of emotional snapshots so that you can remember each event and how to live through it. One of the most traumatic things for him was that he had catheters through his chest into the veins going to the heart so they could, his Hickman was to draw blood or administer medicine. He had an HD catheter when he was in dialysis from renal failure. Now, those spots, you can imagine how vulnerable you would feel, and you go into a protective mode. So you're hyper vigilant about your environment and anybody messing with your trauma spots, and then you guard them. And kids will actually become quite deformed in taking a body posture to protect those spots. So, one of the things that we experienced when he had a surgery under his left armpit, orthoscopic surgery through his rib cage. Now, on the Hickman and the HD catheter and all of his trauma spots, surgical spots, they would put a dressing, and those dressings would have to be changed regularly. And that was a very traumatic event. So we had a ritual where we would become emotionally and physically prepared to deal with the removal, cleaning, and readministering of those tegaderms and dressings. And how I got into this was that that surgical spot under his arm was extremely scary and delicate. It had a tube coming out of it with a vacuum ball to try to pull out any fluid so it didn't collect in his body cavity. So the surgeon came in at night, clipped the stitches, removed the tube, put a new dressing on it, and McCoy was very scared. It was very hard for him to allow her to do that. And the doctor warned us that spot is going to have to be redressed and cleaned in 24 hours. So, what I did is I sat there with him and I said, okay, You're guarding your spot, and I understand, but I'm going to raise my hand, and I just want you to imagine lifting your arm. And then I'm going to do it over and over again. And little by little, I would have him lift his arm a little more, a little more. And I would put up my hand and reach out to him. And soon I said, okay, now lift your arm. And I'm going to put my hand between your arm and your ribs. I won't touch you. And of course, he had to trust me. So when he lifted his arm, I put my hand in between his arm and his ribs and then pulled it back again. So the autonomic consciousness experiences being approached to a trauma, but no bad ending. And that diffuses the charge. So little by little, we can approach it and back off, approach it and back off. And after we did that several times, I was able to, he lifted his arm and I was able to remove the dressing, clean it, and put the new dressing on. And I realized, boy, we were really onto something. And I had no idea that this wasn't actually a process that already existed, although not applied to this application. And Peter Levine, a worldwide renowned expert in trauma, calls it emotional re-experiencing. And he even tells a story where a grown man had lost partial vision. He didn't have 3D vision. He only had two-dimensional vision. He'd been through every medical and psychological exercise and testing he could go through. But when they approached it and re-experienced it little by little, then he was actually able to recall that he witnessed his own father's suicide when he was 3. And the autonomic nervous system, what I call the autonomic consciousness, your higher self, said that's too much information. So it took away his 3D vision. And the minute he re-experienced that without a traumatic ending, he regained his vision, full 3D vision. And the term for this is titration, where you take small bites and chew slowly. You approach it and then digest that, process that little by little. And what happens is, as you approach something and there is no bad ending, again, it dissipates that charge so that you can then experience it and release that trauma. So, the next slide I want to go over is about the living system. And a living system is anything from an atom, even smaller, an electron, a proton, a neutron, are all vibrations, a living system. They all have mass and energy. And what Einstein taught us with his simple equation, E equals mc squared, is that mass is equal to energy. And not just equal, it actually is. 2 plus 2 isn't just equal to 4, it actually is 4. So the third component is information, because every wavelength of vibration, every living system, like I say, from a Planck wave up to an atom, to a molecule, a tissue, a organ, a human, a planet, humanity, and even the universe are all living systems. They all possess mass, energy, and information, and they are inseparable. Information creates your form, and energy makes it move. So if you want to change the living system, all you have to do is change one of those three components. If you change the mass, it changes the energy and the information. It changes the structure. So every living system also has a mode of growth or protection. Now, every bacteria, amoeba, every cell, even electrons that want to join together, they either um, they either attract each other or they repel each other. So, and I also want to state that everything in the universe is Newtonian and a quantum state of being simultaneously. Now, Newtonian is the big objects that can be weighed and measured and tracked and calculated. It's like a mechanical universe. But there's also a quantum aspect to every living system. So the, the bigger the particle, say you have a molecule that's both quantum and Newtonian, it can be measured and located, but it also has a quantum state. It can pop in and out of existence. Now, all living systems, even the human, is part particle and part wave, and we oscillate between particle and wave 1,000 times a second. So when we are triggered and when we are focused in fight or flight, then we are more particle than we are wave. We are more predictable, measurable, reactive. When we are in an open state of being, we're tapping into our quantum state where all possibilities are available. Like I say, when you're triggered in fight or flight, there's one stimulus and one reaction, and it's programmed by that trauma memory that we hold in our soma. When we are open and centered and open to divinity, our right brain connection to divinity, then there can be a stimulus and infinite responses. So that's the difference between growth and being open and being protected and dense and reactive. So I want to talk about DNA. Now, we all have the thumbprint of God, who we are, how tall we are, what color hair, if any, we have. And like all living systems, DNA is a living system, and it is Newtonian and it's quantum. The quantum aspect of DNA is like a radio signal. It travels through space just like a song. And if you were to take a radio receiver and put it out in space ahead of the light years ahead that a song has been traveling. If they broadcast a Beatles song in the 1960s and you were able to go out in space and put that radio and antenna out there, that song would play just like it did here on Earth. So your DNA travels through space as a quantum code, and it updates your physical being 1,000 times a second. But when we have trauma, when it's stored in our soma, it is body armored away from the original code. And when we're put in a traumatic situation or a stressful situation, it creates an epigenetic expression. Now, epigenetic means above the genes. So your genes can be expressed in a number of different ways, but based on your perception of your environment, you'll create an epigenetic expression of yourself. So you have your original code of origin and the epigenetic expression that you're embodying in the present time. So stress in your environment, if you are in a situation of trauma and you first viewed your life as innocent and would never harm you, and then you've been traumatized, you've been hurt, you've been damaged by someone you trust or even a stranger, you then realize that you're not in a safe environment, and you generate an aspect of yourself to deal with that trauma. And that can be a protector aspect, and it protects your original self. And when you have a gap between the aspect you generate to try to survive and be hypervigilant in your environment and protect your original self, that gap is what we talked about in my care philosophy, how the gap between your original self and the aspect you generate is where all disease and illness start. So in evolution, stress in your environment actually creates species variation. So if there is a fish in a mud puddle and it's stressed for air, it'll actually adapt and go out and develop lungs, and fins turn into legs. So you're talking about being able to be your original self, and based on your perception of the environment around you, you can adapt so that you will survive, thrive, and procreate. So moving on. So you have your entry and origin story. And like Timothy Leary and Ram Dass taught us with their study of psychedelics, the set and setting determine the experience, and the experience determines the outcome. So you have your original design, that thumbprint of God, your original DNA manifestation. And you have an origin story, where you entered, what year was it? What city were you born in? What was your belief system of your family? What was the trauma that was happening in your family when your mother was pregnant? So, from that original design, you can have epigenetic expression of those genes in utero, and they even track it from conception through in utero and your birthing story and the environment you're born into. That's what I call your entry and origin story. And with that, you have a set point for your HPA axis. Now, HPA is hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal. Your hypothalamus is your perception of the environment. Your pituitary is the instructions of how to react to that environment. And the adrenal is the set point of your reactivity. Now, if you've never been harmed, if you're innocent and you've been raised in a very wonderful caregiving environment, your threshold, your set point might be very low. You're not going to be very reactive. And if you've been in a traumatic setting, then you might be hypervigilant and react quicker and with a higher degree of reactivity. Now, we're all born with a temperament. It's in that original code. Some people are shy when they're born. Some people are outgoing. Some people are very tolerable. Some are quick to react. That is due to the set points of your entry and origin story. Now, another topic is hedonic adaptation. Hedonic adaptation is your level of joy. Now, when we experience something joyful over and over and over again, we get used to it and it's not as joyful. That's one form of hedonic adaptation. Another form is if we experience trauma over and over, our joy is diminished. Now, it's been studied that pain and pleasure coexist in the same space of the brain. The amygdala is like a tipping point. If you're feeling pleasure, you're not feeling pain or suffering. If you're not feeling pleasure, you're feeling pain and suffering. So this is hedonic adaptation. And it varies depending on your life circumstances, your entry and origin story, the exposure you have to trauma, and can you trust your caregiver? So, a wonderful study on this is done by Gabor Mate. He has a movie called The Wisdom of Trauma and the amazing book, The Myth of Normal. And in the book, The Myth of Normal, he talks about in one chapter called Attachment versus Authenticity. And attachment means your care provider, how attentive they are, how much they pay attention to you, how you co regulate. If you're wound up, they can bring you down. If you're down, they can bring you up. Co-regulation is a main um, set point with your caregiver, and that's the attachment. Now, if you're in an insecure attachment situation and you have to give up your authenticity to get your needs met, then that's what he calls attachment versus authenticity. If you have to give up your authenticity to get attachment, trauma, that's the original trauma. And before I even read the book, I was talking about identity for security. When you have to trade your true identity of who you truly are to gain security in your environment, you lose both. When you give up your identity for security, you lose both. So, this is how we really get deep into aspect generation. When you are not getting your needs met, when you are traumatized and you generate an aspect of yourself to get your needs met and to feel safe, you are setting aside your true self. You're ignoring your true self. And that's what I call adding insult to injury, because you're not allowed to be your true self. And like I said, when you are not acting with authenticity, that is the root cause of all disease and illness. Gabor Mate goes on to say all physical and emotional illness and mental disorders, it can lead to um, bipolarism, schizophrenia, and even multiple personality disorders. And I have witnessed this in my practice where people have been so traumatized that the gap between their original self and the aspect they had to create to endure the trauma is repeatedly traumatized over and over and over again. And you become that aspect you had to create. It has a different worldview. It has different posture. It has different blood chemistry. It has different set points of reactivity. So you actually become that and you forget your true authentic self. So through the STIR method, somatic trauma imprint release, it starts out with this type of teaching and awareness and breathing yourself into a coherent state, which we will go deep into later in the modules. And we can actually reintegrate the aspects of ourselves that we no longer need. Because, like I said, when you are traumatized, you take an emotional snapshot from the level of consciousness that endured the trauma. That means if you were 6 years old and you were traumatized, it's like an emotional snapshot. And then when that is triggered again, you become that 6 year old reactive posture, worldview, blood chemistry, that aspect of yourself. So when I work with, like right now, I'm working with an amazing individual who is a war veteran from the UK. And he was in just a unbelievable situation, as I know most veterans are. And when you are traumatized over and over and over again, what should be explicit memories, meaning I am my original self and I dealt with something on this day and date, and it's a memory, an explicit memory. And then a month later, maybe I went through something else, and that's an explicit memory. So I went through this on this date, and then I went through this on this date. Well, when trauma is chronic, like in a war situation or in a traumatic home environment, those memories are so emotionally charged that the thalamus says to the hippocampus, we are that trauma. It becomes an implicit memory, which means it implicates that that's you. It's who you are. It implies that's who you are. And you no longer have a gap of observation between who you are and the trauma. So understanding this is key to unwinding it, because like stress or trauma or Stacked traumas of implicit memories become post-traumatic stress disorder. So the mechanism that stores trauma is the same mechanism we can unwind to release trauma. And that is a real key aspect. And one of the triads to transcend any event in your life, I call this the triad of transcendence: awareness, understanding, and adjustment. Because if you're not aware of this mechanism, how can you understand it? And how can you unwind it? How can you make an adjustment? So, with awareness, we can then understand it and make the adjustments to the middle to try to effectively release that trauma so that they become explicit memories instead of implicit memories. Because one of the visuals I like is that if you have a timeline of string and this event happens and then this event happens and this event happens, they're strung out. But when they become implicit, it's like they're all mashed together in one big trauma. And you can't differentiate one from the other. But with stir, we can unwind those traumas and breathe between each one and spread them back out. And then they become explicit. This is me, my true self. And this is the aspect I created to deal with this trauma on this day, this trauma on this day, this trauma on this day. So that is the unwinding. So we're going to get deeper into all of those in the modules to come. And I would really encourage you to join me for these future modules. These sessions are going to help you unwind these traumas. Now, whether you're a pediatric patient like my son was, or a pediatric parent like I was, to where those events became implicit of who I was, and I was suffering from PTSD. And through these practices, both my son, myself, and many other care recipients through our practice have unwound their trauma and reduced the PTSD down into explicit memories so that we are not so reactive. We can then respond to our environment as we would love to. So I want to thank you for joining me today. And I would like to do some key self reflections. Number one, as I talked about, I would like you to think about, and I encourage you to journal. Feel free to just think and go through this and process on your own. But anytime you can take things out of the air and put them down on paper, it really helps the unwinding of this trauma. So I highly encourage you to just take some notes and do a little bit of journaling on this. So, number one, what was your origin story? What situation were you born into? Number two, what was your early temperament? And you might want to ask your care provider or your older siblings, um, was I shy? Was I outgoing? Was I an introvert, an extrovert? Was I really reactive and mad, or was I really tolerant? And then you can see how that's changed over the years, and we can revisit that original self. Number three, think about your living system. What information has created your mass, and what energy do you use to make it move? Is your energy depleted? Have you dropped into the dorsal dive, which we will go over later? Do you go into the fetal position when you are traumatized? These are all things that we will explore. So I invite you to take these notes on your living system. Now think, what would be your trauma imprint? What would have happened that left an imprint in your body that is triggered and then you react as if you were still in that environment? And then who is your protector aspect? What part of you shows up on a stressful job or in a traumatic situation or in a family environment that's very challenging? Who is your protector self, your protector aspect? And then who is your true original self? We'll get back to that. So I'd like to thank you for joining me. Again, I'm Jeff Granville, And I love to work with people to help reduce trauma, to release trauma, and then integrate the lessons we learned from trauma. So once again, thank you.